Florida primaries are more than 3 months away, but Republican Governor Rick Scott is already mounting an expensive campaign against incumbent Democratic Senator Bill Nelson. According to Politico, a super PAC tied to Scott spent $2.4 million on an attack ad that calls Nelson a, quote, career politician and calls on voters to, quote, term limit him. Earlier, my colleague Elaine Quijano spoke with the article's author, Marc Caputo. He writes Politico's Florida Playbook and covers the state's political landscape ahead of the midterms.
Mark, on Tuesday, Democrat Javier Fernandez won a Florida House seat, beating Republican Andrew Vargas. It's the fourth special election win for Democrats in the state. How big of a boon is this for Florida Democrats?
Well, it's a pretty big one because it just signifies that every time there's been a contested bellwether election in Florida, the Democrats have won since 2016. So they've won swing seats that are kind of a bluish shade of purple, like this last seat that was in the Miami area. They've also won blood red districts or House districts, like one in Sarasota. They've won more kind of toss-up districts, like one in Miami that was a state Senate race. And they won a St. Pete mayoral's race that looked like the Republican was going to win until President Obama and Joe Biden kind of swooped in, or I should say former President Obama and former Vice President Biden swooped in and kind of ginned up Democratic votes. And what we're seeing kind of consistently is that Republicans are either in retreat, kind of not showing up, and Democrats are showing up in force or in solid enough numbers where they're continually winning and Republicans are continually losing. Now, it's usually a mistake to forejudge or forecast who's going to win in a Florida election. But when you start to look at the 2018 midterms, you'd much rather be in the Democrat situation and their position than in the Republican one.
Yeah, that is an interesting dynamic. Well, according to a Quinnipiac poll, at the end of February, more than half of Florida voters disapproved of President Trump's job performance. Are Republican candidates in Florida embracing the president or distancing themselves from him?
That's a good question. You're not seeing them hug the president, say, the way they have in the past. So a great example of that is Governor Rick Scott. He's been a big Trump booster. He chaired the super PAC, or one of the super PACs that supported President Trump. But since Governor Scott announced his Senate bid, he so far has kind of conveniently or coincidentally not been in the same Florida cities as President Trump when President Trump has been here. And that's kind of been notable. Now, you have to understand that Governor Scott is running in a general election against Senator Bill Nelson, or Governor Scott is kind of token opposition in a Republican primary. Now, the other candidates statewide, say Adam Putnam, who's running for governor, and Rep. Ron DeSantis, since they're in a primary and since the primary vote is by and large very Trumpy, you're seeing them sidle much more up to Donald Trump. So Ron DeSantis essentially was endorsed by Donald Trump, and he's playing that big, and he hopes to ride that to a big primary win come August, which is when the primary is in Florida. We have a late primary, I think, on August 28th.
Well, I want to ask you more about Governor Scott in a moment, but the upcoming midterms are the first major elections since hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans were displaced by Hurricane Maria, with many of them settling in Florida. How could that change the political landscape in your state?
It could change the political landscape if they showed up and registered to vote and then voted. One of the big problems that Democrats have had, understand that Democrats have by and large banked on Puerto Rican votes. They've enjoyed Puerto Rican support by, say, like a 7-3 or a 6-4 margin or split relative to Republicans. That is, when Puerto Ricans show up and vote on the mainland, they tend to vote Democrat. The problem is that the Puerto Rican voters in Florida don't really show up to vote in very high numbers, especially in midterms. And this has kind of really perplexed and flummoxed Democrats statewide because they continually have lost elections. They've lost the presidential election and they lost the last two midterms. So Democrats are starting to come to the realization that, oh my, the Puerto Rican vote might not be as big as we hoped it was, because though we probably have 100,000, give or take, 10,000 or so, or, a few dozen thousand in the state, what they haven't really done is shown up and decided, okay, we're going to register to vote. We haven't really seen any evidence of it. Understand it's May, and there's a lot of time for Democrats to make up this lost ground, but so far it just hasn't materialized.
Well, earlier this week, Florida Governor Rick Scott, who is running for Senate, was endorsed by Puerto Rico's non-voting member of Congress. How is the governor viewed by Puerto Ricans and other Hispanic voters in the state?
Also a good question. I hesitate to really answer that without looking at polling. But what we have seen in the past few midterms, the times that Governor Scott has run in 2014 and 2010, he's done rather well with the Hispanic vote. Now, by and large, that's buoyed and that's bolstered by Cuban American support, which tends to be very strongly Republican and is very reliable. Puerto Rican vote, again, is not so reliable either in midterms or sometimes even in general elections. But what you're doing is you're seeing Governor Scott kind of playing on Bill Nelson's half of the field. These are votes, the Puerto Rican vote, so to speak, that the Democrat needs to count on. And Governor Scott has been very aggressive in courting this vote over the past few weeks or the past few months. He's been to Puerto Rico 5 times. When Governor Scott announced his Senate bid, he had the Secretary of State / Lieutenant Governor of Puerto Rico at his event and speaking on his behalf. And then, as he said, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, who is the non-voting member of Congress from Puerto Rico, has also endorsed him. Now, Governor Scott probably doesn't think he's going to win the Puerto Rican vote, but if he shaves enough support away from Bill Nelson, that's probably part of a winning strategy for the Republican come November.
All right, a lot of fascinating dynamics there in your state. Marc Caputo in Miami. Marc, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.